Everything was intertwined with the complexity of a three-dimensional puzzle. A puzzle in which truth was not necessarily fact, and fact not necessarily truth. So I just finished my third Murakami book, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. I think this one was my favorite one so far. It says on the cover here, dreamlike, Murakami is a genius. And I think that's a great sort of thing to have on the book. It really sums it up. The book is very dreamlike, in the sense that in a dream, sort of the laws of nature, the laws of causality don't really matter, but the characters in the dream, when you're in a dream, you're not like, wow, why did that happen? That doesn't make any sense. You just go with it. And that's very much this book. Things happen, crazy things happen, wacky, weird things that make no sense. And for the most part, the characters just roll with it and just accept it as if you're in a dream. And yeah, this book, Murakami is a genius. It really hit home to me in the sections when he's writing about the Second World War, or I guess it would be, I don't know, the Second Sino-Japanese War, but like the Japanese in Manchuria and Manchukuo. He has a whole two stories on set in that period, and they read very much like historical fiction. And they could have just, I think he could write he might have written historical fiction, but I think he's just a brilliant writer, and that really stood out to me. He's still problematic though, especially in terms of his misogyny or sexism. Those might be too strong of words, but like I've seen this again and again in his books, that the main character is a male in their 20s or 30s, and the majority of the other characters that surround this male main character are females, and the first comments we always get about those females are on their looks, and most of those females all have sexual relationships with the main character. That happens again and again in his books, but no one's perfect. If you can get past that, which maybe for a woman you can't get past that, totally understandable and fine. If you can get past that and just take the book without that, he's just a phenomenal writer, which I guess I don't need to say. Everyone sort of knows that, which is why he's so popular. This book's a very big book. I think his second biggest book, and his biggest book being IQ 84, which I'd really like to read, but it is an investment in time. This one's about 607 pages. It was originally published in three volumes, and it really shows in this, like volume 1 to volume 2 to volume 3. They're increasingly getting wackier and crazy, but also the characters really, the characters don't change internally, but the set of characters change. We have different characters in each sort of section. The main character continues, but he sort of meets and is surrounded by and interacts with different characters in each of these three sections. So like the first volume is the main character, Toru Okada, at home with his wife Kumiko, and their cat has gone missing. And so he had been laid off from work. Sorry, he wasn't laid off, he quit. He was sort of a gopher for a law firm. He wanted to get into law originally, but found out it wasn't for him, and so he quit. His wife works at a magazine. She works very long hours and is gone a lot of the time. He's just home by himself. He looks after the housework and the cooking and shopping and whatnot. But their cat's missing, so his wife's like, hey, find this cat. This cat's very important to her, especially. It's a cat that they found when they first met, or they first got married, and has been with them since they've been married. They've been married for 6 years now, so the cat's sort of a symbol for their relationship. And with it missing, Kumiko, his wife, really wants him to find it back. So that's that first volume, is him trying to find this cat. The second volume introduces these two sisters, the Kano sisters. So again, a different sort of set of characters. And Kumiko has gone missing at this point. Like, I know a lot of his books have been really dark and depressing, but this one sort of hit me the most as just the hardest in ways to get through. His wife, one morning, she asks him to zipper up the back of her dress, and he does so, and he's always commenting on the way her back looked at that moment. But he smells a new cologne, and he makes the comment, oh, you have a new cologne? And she just brushes it off and rushes off the door to work. So he goes into the bathroom, is doing cleaning, and he finds the package of this, or he finds the cologne. It's like in a really expensive cologne. He's like, why did she just buy this? And then he notices the packaging in the trash, and it was like gift wrapped. And he's like, someone gave my wife a very fancy bottle of cologne, and he assumes it's a man. And that's like, it clicks to me like right away, like she's cheating on you, because previous to this she had been coming home late, like super late, consistently, like more so than she had been in when their marriage first started. And it just like, he takes it. He's such a passive character. He just takes it. He takes everything and goes with the flow, and he doesn't really get super upset about it. He just sort of thinks like, my wife is sleeping with another man. And anyways, after this morning, she doesn't come back. A few days go by and she just doesn't return. And eventually he gets a letter in the mail from her where she's like, and it's so bad. Like she said, hey, look, I loved you and I've always loved you. I still love you, but I'm leaving because I met this man at work. We've been sleeping together for a while now, and I don't love him, but I can't get over the sex. It's the best feeling I've ever had. It feels so good. I can't even control myself when I'm around him. It was just, the desire was so strong. I just had to be with him. So I feel really bad about it. So I'm leaving you for him. Like, just, and he reads this letter and he doesn't like get upset. He doesn't break down. He just sort of takes it at face value and rolls with it, which is kind of strange. And maybe one of my criticisms, but I guess that's just the characters. He's so, not just stoic, but emotionless. Like, what a hard thing to read, that coming from your wife. And I always like to sort of swap gender roles. Like, imagine this was a book written by a woman from a woman's perspective, and her husband leaves her, and he's like, oh no, I still loved you, but I met this girl, and she was so attractive, and it was the best sex I ever had, and I couldn't control myself. I just had to keep having sex with her, so I did. Like, in that scenario, it would be like, oh, what an awful human being. Like, get rid of him. You're better off without him. But when it's the woman doing it, I mean, I'd still feel the same way. But Toru, just sort of, he doesn't get upset, but he refuses to get a divorce. So there are pressures on him from the outside saying, you need to get a divorce. And he refuses to until he can speak to her face to face and clear this up. So that's the second volume. And then the third volume, the Kano sisters sort of go away, and I'll go into all the characters in a minute. The third volume, he meets the Akasakas and a mother and son, and sort of gets wrapped up in their weird business thing and kind of works for them until eventually the book ends with him sort of freeing his wife from her weird mental captivity by her brother. Like I said, the book is super wacky, and going through the story chronologically would, first of all, take a very long time, but also would be very difficult because it is so dreamlike. And causality doesn't really exist. A doesn't really cause B. A will just happen spontaneously, and then sometimes B will happen before A. But he is a genius because he can write this wacky, crazy world, but like a person in a dream, the reader finds it easy to accept. Like, yeah, it's really weird and crazy, but it's not random and out of place. It all sort of makes sense in a weird way. So this book is all about connections. People and characters and places and things across time and space, all interacting and all interconnecting, and relationships characters have with each other and with people from the past, and it's all of these things so intricately connected, which really shows off his genius again. So there is this main story of Toru losing his cat and then losing his wife and trying to find her. But there is a lot of that interspersed with background and character. So we'll meet a character and then there'll be a whole chapter on some wacky, crazy background thing. Or he'll start talking about his house. So it's a first person narrative. He'll start talking about his house and how he bought his house, or he's renting his house from his uncle, and then he'll give his uncle's whole backstory. So the main story itself is, I don't know how to say this, but a lot of this book is about characters and all these different characters. And we get them introduced in different ways. So it's not just the first person narrative. We also have newspaper clippings. So some chapters will just be newspaper clippings sort of describing the hanging house, this weird house that he's involved in, and sort of rumors about it. We also have chapters that are just letters from other characters, which happens a few times. So it is really a big book, but there's so much variety to it in the narrative, but in the way the narrative's presented, that it's just a real pleasure to read. So instead of going through the plot, the intricate plot with lots of detail, I'm just going to go through the list of the main characters and sort of explain their background and who they are and how they connect to the plot. Because, like I said, a lot of this book is just introducing these characters. So we have this girl, Mei Kasahara. Mei is a 16-year-old girl. She lives across the road from this house that's seen as a house that has lots of bad luck. It's an abandoned house. And she meets Toru as he's looking for his cat. So he's looking for his cat through this alleyway that's in the back of all these houses. That's where he bumps into Mei. She's really sort of obsessed with death. It turns out that she's killed her boyfriend they were on a motorcycle ride, and she like covered his face with her hands, which caused them to crash, and he died, which she had done before, but she's sort of weirdly obsessed with death. And at a point in the story, Toru goes down into a well in the house across from her. Why he does this, I'll explain later, but he goes down into this well and stays there for like 2 days. And Mei notices him down there at one point and pulls sort of the rope ladder up and locks him in. And after talking to him about like, hey, I could leave you here to die and no one would ever know. Like, I could totally just kill you. And then she sort of seemingly does so, but she's just sort of toying with him, but like in a really psychopathic way. So she's a strange one. She's got issues. And again, even though she's 16, she is described sexually, like one time being in a super thin bikini, and at one point she like licks or like sucks on his face because he's got this mark on his face from the well. Anyways, and then at another point when she's writing letters to him, she says like, oh, I thought about what if you raped me? Like, what would I do? And like, why does the author need to even consider those things? Anyways, she doesn't want to go to school because she doesn't really want to. And she forms a strange bond with Toru. She works as someone who surveys bald people to see how many bald people are in certain areas of the city for this wig company. And yeah, she gets this weird bond with Toru and sort of sees him as someone who sort of spices life up because he's really weird. And he does things like goes to the bottom of a well for 2 days. But eventually, at the end of this, so she's in the second half of the book when Kumiko's missing. Not the second half, the second section of the 3. And at the end of that section, she decides she's going to go back to school for whatever reason. Toru has convinced her that life can be weird and she needs to get back on with life. In the 3rd section, she's no longer part of the plot, but she's constantly sending letters to Toru, which he never actually receives in the story, but we get them as chapters. So in these letters, she reveals that she quit school again. She hated it. It was like a sort of upper-class preppy school she couldn't stand. And she went to this factory in the mountains to work on making wigs. And she sort of loves it there, which is kind of strange. But, I mean, a lot of this is strange. So she just lives there. And like I said, in the 3rd section of the book, we just get these letters from her. At the very end of the book, Toru goes to visit her at the at her job and chats with her and sort of explains the ending of the book, and that's how the book ends with Toru and Mei. So that's Mei Kasahara. We've got the Kano sisters. So we've got Malta Kano, who's like a psychic medium, has sort of weird powers. She is contacted. Kumiko, Toru's wife, contacts her to help with their missing cat. She comes recommended from Kumiko's family, who's really into psychics and stuff like that. Her name's not really Malta. She takes on the name after spending 3 years in Malta, doing weird things with water. Anyway, so she's kind of strange. She visits Toru in his dreams a few times. She apparently has that ability. But we see a lot more of her sister, Krita Kano. So Krita, again, not really named Krita, they just sort of name her after the island Crete for whatever reason. She's Malta's sister and her assistant, her younger sister. And we get her backstory, which is really strange. So she sort of grew up in intense physical pain, like constant physical pain. And when she was like 16, she decided, okay, that's it. I'm going to kill myself. This is the only way I can escape this pain. So she drives a car and tries to crash the car. She has a major accident, but she doesn't actually kill herself. She lives, but for whatever reason, she's now lost the ability to feel pain, but not in a good way, in sort of a totally numb, feeling nothing way. So she's sort of gone from one direction to the complete opposite. And she needs to pay her brother back for the car she smashed. She needs a lot of money, and so she doesn't really know how to get that money really quick. So she decides to become a prostitute. So she starts prostituting herself out, and again, because she doesn't feel anything, doesn't really bother her. She starts making really good money. She then gets captured by a bunch of mafia thugs, and they gang rape her and videotape it and try to blackmail her into working for them as a prostitute. And so she's like, fine, whatever, doesn't matter. So she keeps doing it. She's making less money now, but she's still just doing it. And that's when she comes into contact with Noboru Wataya, who is Kumiko's brother, and he's the main antagonist of the series, the real bad guy. And he, like, I don't know if the word rape is used, but he defiles her or assaults her in some way. I think the word rape is used, despite her being a prostitute. Of course, rape can still happen with prostitutes, yeah, and because of that, he does something weirdly magical and sort of removes something from her body, not like physically, but like some mental, spiritual essence thing from her, which it's hinted that would normally cause her a lot of mental anguish and sort of almost like removing her soul, but because she had gone from extreme pain to extreme numbness, whatever he did actually sort of fixed her, so she's sort of back to normal. And so she gives up prostitution, and her sister Malta comes back to Japan, and she becomes her assistant and works in like weird psychic stuff. And so yeah, she meets with Toru. She meets with him in her dream, and they have sex a few times in their dreams, and then also in real life. And then near the end of the second section, because this is the Kano sisters are in the second section, she says that she's going to travel to Crete. She wants Toru to come with her, and Toru kind of suggests that yeah, I will. And then she goes off. Then he just sort of decides not to, or kind of forgets about it. Just doesn't go with her. And it's revealed in the third section through like weird dream sequences that Krita has had a baby. And at one point it's said that it's Toru's baby. They named it Corsica. And then at another section they're like, well, it's half Toru's baby and also half Lieutenant Mamiya's baby, who is another character we'll get to, which doesn't really make any sense how that could be. I don't know. The whole issue with Toru having babies, like he talks about how he had a girlfriend before his wife, who he got pregnant, and they had to go through an abortion, and he seemed really supportive of her, and he went with her and he paid for it and everything, but he felt really bad about it, and he felt like all the women in the abortion clinic were judging him. And then his wife Kumiko got pregnant, and he didn't want to go through that again, so he kind of wanted to have the baby, but financially they were not in a place for one of them to stop working at that time and have a baby. And so he didn't push her on it. He stated his opinion and then said, well, it's your body, it's your choice at the end of things, which I thought was like really good of him, like from a feminist perspective. As problematic as Murakami can be, I think this was like a positive of this character. Maybe I'm wrong in that. But anyways, one time Toru was away in Sapporo in Hokkaido for work, and Kumiko took that opportunity to go with the abortion without him. And Toru sort of saw that as sort of the changing point in Kumiko when things sort of got worse. And it's revealed later that she sort of sees herself as having some sort of genetic defect. So there's a problem with her sister that we'll talk about, who's dead, and her brother, and so having that baby sort of brought this all up and did sort of start this downward spiral that she's gone through. Also in Sapporo, Toru is at a bar, and there's this musician there that will come back later. But anyways, he meets this musician who sort of does some weird things, or sort of has this sort of weird talk about empathy. Anyways, so that was Krita Kano, and then I sort of bled into Toru. So Toru, the main character, like I said, he's a very passive guy. He doesn't seem to have any emotions. He looking for the cat, then he's looking for his wife. He doesn't really know what to do with himself. He gets caught up in all this weird stuff and just sort of accepts it. He, because of a story that Lieutenant Mamiya tells him, which we'll talk about him in a second, he goes down into this abandoned well in this building, and in this abandoned well he's sort of transported to this like dream world where he's in this sort of maze like hotel where there's this woman, this like secretive woman who he can't see her face, who is like very seductive and sexual, and someone's like beating on the door of the hotel, and he has to escape before that person gets there because it's super dangerous. And anyways, when he comes out of this dream sequence, he's got this blue mark on his right cheek, and anyways, that happens to him in the well. One of the things about him is that he really hates his brother-in-law Noboru Wataya, who is Kumiko's brother. And like I said, Noburo's the main bad guy of the series, so we'll talk about in a second. But that's the only time that Toru ever shows any emotion or gets upset is in a conversation with Noboru, where he just like flat out says, you can't use me like you use everyone else. I know your secrets. Whatever, which kind of startles Wataya. And of course we have Kumiko, who is the wife of Toru and the sister of Noboru, and she had an older sister who was in between Noboru and her, who had died. Now originally she said it was of food poisoning, but it's revealed later that her sister had killed herself because of something that Noboru had done to her. And there's some weird sort of incestual sexual references that Noboru was sort of using her in some way, did something similar to what he did to Krita, took something out of her body, which caused her to commit suicide. And Noboru then turns his attention onto Kumiko, and that's why Kumiko, after having this abortion, sort of has a downward spiral because she sees that she's going to be just like her brother, and she has this weird sexual urge, and she goes out, and it turns out she wasn't just sleeping with one man, she was sleeping with like numerous men, and like contracted an STD, and all kinds of horrible stuff happened to her. But it's not really explained that well, but that's not a criticism, it doesn't have to be. But Noboru has some sort of weird effect on Kumiko. So just I'll talk about Noboru a bit now. So he, like I said, he's got this weird thing with his sisters and this weird magical ability to be an awful person. But outwardly, the public love him. He was like this intellectual who wrote this really fancy book, and then he got into politics throughout the book, and throughout this book, not the book he wrote. And so he just like was the darling. Everyone loves him. He's on TV all the time. He's like a big personality, big public figure. But Toru knows the real him and sort of hates him as like a fraud. I haven't mentioned, but this book was published in the late 90s, but takes place in 1984, 1985. So it is a neat glimpse into Tokyo in the 80s. So the next two characters I would say would be Mr. Honda and Lieutenant Mamiya. So Mr. Honda is a character who doesn't really appear, well, he appears in the book. He is dead before the events. No, he's not dead. He dies during the events of this book. So he was a psychic that Kumiko and Toru had gone to before they got married, and then after they got married, because like I said, Kumiko's family was really into this psychic sort of stuff, and so they'd go to him to appease their family, and he would just sort of tell them stories about the war. So he fought in Manchuria in the Second World War. I want to say the Second Sino-Japanese War. Calling it the Second World War, the book calls it the Second World War, so I guess that doesn't really matter. And when he dies, he bequeaths something to Toru. And he gets his friend Lieutenant Mamiya, who's this guy from the war, to deliver it to Toru, and it turns out just to be an empty box. So Mr. Honda's real reason for getting this is to make a connection between Mamiya and Toru, to get them to meet. And so they do, and when Mamiya's at Toru's house, he explains tells his story of the war, which I'll get into, and then later he continues to share it through a series of stories. A series of letters that he's sending to Toru, and it's really interesting story. Like, one of my favorite parts of the book was reading about this World War II story. So it involved Mr. Honda and Lieutenant Mamiya. That's how they met. Another guy, and then a fourth guy who's a spy, basically a Japanese spy. And so they're all in Manchuria. They're on this sort of border region with Mongolia, that sort of no man's land. And their mission is to sneak into Mongolia. The spy will go off and do whatever he does, and that's what happens. And then when the spy returns, he has this secret document. He's like, no one can find this secret document until we get across the border. Like, we need to get across the border. If we get captured, this needs to be destroyed or hidden, or like, and I have to be killed before the information gets out. So whatever it is, super top secret, super important. But of course, they get captured by Mongolian and Soviet forces before they can get back across the border. But when they do get captured, they notice Honda's missing, and also the document's missing. So Honda, because he's a psychic, he took the document and escaped. And before this happened, he told Mamiya, like, no matter what happens here, you are going to live the longest of all of us, and you will not die until you're back in Japan. Which Mamiya is kind of like, yeah, sure, whatever. How could you know that? But of course, that's what happens. Like I said, Honda and the document are missing, but the spy and the two others are captured. The one guy who was standing guard gets just outright murdered. So Mamiya and the spy are there, and this Soviet, this Russian guy comes over and is going to interrogate them, and he gets one of his Mongolian goons to skin this spy alive. And they literally skin him alive, and he doesn't tell them anything, either because he doesn't know anything or he's just that good. So literally skins this man while Mamiya is watching. And after they've done that, the Russian turns and he's like, well, if this guy didn't know anything, you definitely don't. So we're not going to bother torturing you. We're just going to, he says, I'm going to let you live. And what they do is they take him to a well and throw him in the well. Or they put a gun to his head and say, you can either jump in the well or we'll shoot you now. And he jumps into the well. And Mamiya is in the bottom of that well for I don't know how long, a couple days, and he makes a point of, because the well's like, it's a shaft, the sunlight only reaches it when the sun's at its peak, and then the sun shines straight down, and just for a few minutes until the sun passes. And he talks about the feeling of that sunlight on him, but then he also talks about how he died in that well. So to Mamiya, that's the moment that he died spiritually, in a way, or not emotionally, but yeah, spiritually. That's where he died, and he's sort of continued existing since that point, but he's never really felt alive since then. And so he is rescued from the well by Honda, and they hide the secret document, whatever it was, and I kept wanting them to go back and discover it, or bring it back to Japan, or figure out what this document is, but they never do. So supposedly out there somewhere in Mongolia is this secret document that's still buried. They escape back to Manchuria, or Manchukuo, and at this point they both get reassigned, and Honda ends up going back to Japan before the war ends, because he gets really sick, I think it was. But Mamiya sort of doesn't want to go on living, and so he volunteers for the Soviet front, does a suicidal charge, and gets knocked out, and then a tank runs over his hand, and he loses his left hand. And he would have died there, but he was mumbling in Russian because he had studied Russian, and so the Russians capture him, take him back to a medical camp, and sort of heal him in order to use him as a translator. So after the war, a lot of Japanese, I never even thought about this. Like, when the war ended, I thought, oh, the Americans took over Japan and occupied it, and they all lived happily ever after. But a lot of the Japanese that were in Manchuria and China, when the Soviets came rolling in, were captured by the Soviets and sent to Siberia to work in mines, and a lot of them died there. And I know they were the aggressors, and the Japanese did horrific things in the war, but still, like, on an individual basis, you got to realize how horrible this would have been for these people. You can say they deserved it or whatever, but still, and I don't think this book it, it doesn't revel in the horrible things Japan did, but it doesn't take a stance that Japan, like the Japanese, were the victims in this. It does mention the horrible things that Japan does, and it's sort of trying to reconcile with that in a way. Anyways, that's a different conversation. So Mamiya gets taken to Siberia. There, he's at this sort of camp where he notices one of the other prisoners is Russian, and it turns out to be the person who had skinned someone alive, or who had ordered someone skinned alive, and they sort of meet and they recognize each other. And Mamiya helps him sort of gain power, and sort of this man who was a political prisoner becomes sort of the sort of gang boss, or the even the feudal lord of this little fiefdom, which he's made this camp out of. And but in like 1949, Mamiya gets sort of repatriated to Japan, and all the Japanese go back to Japan, and Mamiya has this weird. I mean, it would be so weird. He goes back to, and it's something like 12 years since he stepped foot in Japanese soil, and he's there, and he goes to his grave. So his parents had buried him like in 1945. So many Japanese had died overseas. Like there's no way of keeping track. So they just assumed he was dead because he didn't come back. So his grave's there, and also his parents' grave, because they had died in the intervening years. And he had not a wife, but a girl that was sort of promised to him. But like I said, it was 12 years, and so she got married and had kids of her own with someone else. And so he was just sort of, like he said, he felt like he died back in that well. And he got a job as a middle school teacher and taught for years. And now he's, I don't know what he is, retired. But that's his whole story. And we get that in different sections throughout this book. And I love that section. I thought it was really good. Okay, so the final two characters are the Akasakas. So we'll start with Nutmeg Akasaka. So Toru. So Toru doesn't really know what he's doing. I think it's Mamiya who tells him to go out and people watch. It's after Mamiya's story about being in the well that Toru goes down into the well for a few days. But he also gets out and like people watches at this station for whatever reason. And that's when this woman who becomes known as Nutmeg Akasaka notices him and is like, "What are you doing here?" Like, she's like, "I'm just watching people." She's like, "I've noticed you a lot before. Do you need money?" He's like, "Nah." And then there's another sequence where Toru notices that musician from that bar in Sapporo all those years ago, and he follows him. But the guy must have notices that he's being followed, so he sort of slips into this building. And when Toru goes in, the guy jumps out with a bat and starts beating Toru. But then Toru like overpowers him, takes the bat and beats the crap out of this guy, which is a very strange sequence, one of many. And then Toru takes the bat home and like gets on the bus covered in blood with a baseball bat, and that baseball bat sort of becomes a totem for him that he keeps in the well. Anyways, but so the well and this sort of this sort of bad luck house gets flattened, and the well is filled in. And so he wants to go back in that well because it's sort of a weird spiritual place for him. So he's like, he needs money. He needs to figure out a way to buy this property, and he finds out that it would be like 80 million yen. So that's his next goal. And he's people watching again, and he meets this woman. She's like, "You sure you don't need money?" He's like, "Actually, I do. I need 80 million yen." She's like, "That's a lot of money. I'll see what I can do." And gives him her card, which is an address. And so he goes to this place, and we find out that she performs some sort of task for very wealthy women, and she does this very discreetly. Some form of therapy, but like weird magical therapy, where she like touches their head and sort of thinks happy thoughts and like moves stuff around in their mind and removes something, which sort of lets these women be at peace for a few weeks till they have to come back. And it's very discreet, and they pay a ton of money. So she's super, super wealthy. And she sets up this business, this fashion business, as sort of a cover. And she's really obsessed with like fashion and being proper. And so she takes Toru and buys him so many outfits and gets him all these suits tailored, and is like, I will pay for all of this, but you always have to be looking good, your best around me. And so she has this son, who I'm going to call him Cinnamon. So the names, she never gives her name, and Toru's like, what do I call you? She's like, what do you mean? You don't need to call me anything. He's like, what if I saw you on the street and I wanted to call your name? She'd be like, oh, okay, that's one instance I could think when names are important. And he's like, well, I just named my cat Mackerel because names can be random and arbitrary. And she's like, okay, well, call me Nutmeg, and call my son Cinnamon. So they become Cinnamon and Nutmeg Akasaka, which the family name, I think, is just from the place where they work, is Akasaka, where they live. I don't think it's their actual last name. Anyway, so her son Cinnamon, he lost the ability to speak when he was a child. We get this in a chapter, very strange chapter, which is third person, so it's a bit different, and I think it's present tense. It might be past tense, where he's just like a 6-year-old boy. He hears something outside his window, and it's the wind-up bird, which the wind-up bird is the whole thing I'll get to, and sees these two men under the tree. One of them climbs up the tree to get something. The other one digs a hole, and then they bury something at the base of the tree. He goes out and digs it up and finds it's a still beating heart. And then he thinks that one of the men was his father. And from that moment on, he sort of loses the ability to speak. He never speaks. So that's sort of Cinnamon's weird quirk. But he's also like very particular and very brilliant, and he has this whole computer system set up and this whole security system, and he's just like, he can do anything sort of boy. He's like, I think he's like 20 in this book. So his father, Nutmeg's husband, was murdered for whatever reason, but not just murdered, he was chopped into pieces and hacked to bits and had all of his organs removed, including his heart. Just another weird aspect to this weird, wacky story. And so Toru needs money, so Nutmeg and Cinnamon sort of hire him on, because Nutmeg wants to sort of retire from this weird job she has, and she gets Toru to start doing the same thing. So he apparently has this weird magical power to give these women peace for a certain amount of time. And so they construct a new house on the plot of the sort of bad luck house, and they dig the well out, and they put like a steel ladder in there and this contraption where he can shut the door, the top of it when he's at the base of it. He keeps his bat down there, and they put really high walls around the house, and it's super secretive. So this is the whole third section of the book, is this weird Akasaka family thing. And this is when we get a bunch of chapters that are just newspaper clippings trying to explain like what's going on with this house, who owns this house now. And Nutmeg also tells some stories about her childhood, which also involved Manchuria in the 1940s. And so we get sort of a second glimpse of Manchuria in the Second World War, and how it's all connected, and how her father was this veterinarian at this zoo, and how these Japanese soldiers came in and had to kill the animals, some of the more dangerous predators in the zoo, because the Soviets were coming, and they didn't want, and the animals were a danger, and her father had this sort of black and blue mark on his cheek since birth, which is identical to the one Toru has, which is the connection that she made and why she sort of approached him and offered him this job. And at one point in the story, the Japanese soldiers have to execute these Chinese prisoners, and one of them is killed with a baseball bat, beat to death. And because he had used a baseball bat to kill some Japanese soldiers in order to escape. Anyway, so that's the sort of connection with the baseball bat. Like I said, there's all these weird connections, and then stories about how she and her Nutmeg and her mother had to leave her father, and they got aboard this boat and were heading for Japan when this American submarine popped up, and we're like, we're giving you 10 minutes to evacuate and we're sinking your ship. But at that moment, the sort of armistice happened, not armistice, but Japan unconditionally surrendered, and so the submarine did not sink the ship. So just another sort of view into Japan, not Japan, sorry, well, the Japanese Empire in the 1940s. Again, really cool. I love the historical fiction aspects of this. Maybe because the historical fiction bits, the Chinese bits, do not have any magical realism to them. They're just straight stories. The magical realism comes with the connection and linkage with the rest of the story as a whole. Anyway, so that is all the characters. Ooh. But like I said, the book ends with Toru. I guess I haven't said. So the book ends with Toru going into the well, and he finally manages to get back into the sort of maze hotel room and discovers that the woman on the bed he thinks is Kumiko, who is trapped there, and she's trapped by Noboru for whatever reason. And Noboru, is it Noburo? I think it's Noboru. I've been saying his name totally wrong this whole Noburo. Anyways, he, the big bad guy, has been keeping her there, and so he's the one that is entering the room. So there's always someone that's beating on the door and is about to enter when Toru has to flee. But at this moment, Toru's like, no longer. And Kumiko gives him a bat, and so he takes the bat and he beats this person to a bloody pulp. And he gets sort of cut up in the exchange as well. Again, this is all in the weird dream realm in the well. And then he's like, I freed you, Kumiko, come with me, and whatever. And then he wakes up back in the well, and he notices the well is now filled with water, like it had been dry this whole time. And he's actually cut and stabbed, and he's really knocked out, but Cinnamon comes and rescues him, and he gets sort of looked after and slowly recovers. And it's revealed that they will see on the news that Noboru has had a stroke or something and is in a coma now. So whatever Toru had done to him in that weird dream realm has effects in the real world. Also, so a bit before this, so Kumiko and Toru would not divorce Kumiko. His convictions became stronger that he needs to sort of free her, and that he needs to speak with her face to face. And he's in communications with Noboru this whole time, and Noboru's like, get a divorce, like, free my sister so I can like be evil and control her or whatever. They had a chat through a computer, which in 1985 is pretty cool, where Kumiko sort of lays out the truth to him, but says like, leave me, I'm broken, whatever. But he's like, no, I'll free you. So he frees her by beating up Noboru in that weird place, and then finally Kumiko sends him another letter and reveals everything to him, and then says at the end of it, I'm going now to the hospital where my brother is, and I'm going to unplug the life support and kill him. Like, now that I'm finally free, we need to kill him and finish it off once and for all. So she does that, but she's on trial now for murder, but she elects to remain in prison for sort of self-penitence, but also to keep her away from the sort of the media and everyone, and to till it all blows over. And it's sort of expected that she'll have a light sentence, because he was already sort of, I don't know if they know that he was abusive, but he was sort of, he was living on life support, so pulling the plug, she kind of had authority to do so as his sister, but anyways. And so that's when Toru goes and visits Mei Kasahara and explains this whole situation to her. And that's how it ends, with not with Kumiko and Toru getting back together so much, but it's hinting that they will once she's sort of done her time. Even though she sort of is disgusted with herself and what she's done, Toru seems to be so totally okay with it. Anyway, so that was a very long explanation of the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. But wait, I forgot to talk about the actual the title. So the Wind Up Bird Chronicle is, first of all, it's the name of the story that Cinnamon wrote, which is sort of a fictional account of what his grandfather, Nutmeg's father, the veterinarian of the zoo, experienced in Manchuria, based on stories that Nutmeg had told her son, but with the gaps filled in, just sort of creatively, I guess. It's called that because of this wind-up bird that features in Nutmeg's stories. This bird that makes it sound like something being wound up, like creak, 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 or whatever. I don't know what it sounds like. So that's one aspect of it. Also, that is the name that Kumiko and Toru came up for this bird that they hear in their back garden once in a while. There's this bird they call the wind-up bird, because it again makes that same sound. And he refers to it as the bird that sort of winds the spring of the world. So when the bird's making this noise, it's sort of winding up the spring of the world, so this world can keep spinning and everything can go on as normal. And the bird is absent for most of the book, so the world is not sort of spinning, and the world is, something's wrong with the world. It's also the name that Mei refers to, sort of the nickname Mei has for Toru. She, for whatever reason, thinks Toru Okada is a strange name, so she calls him Mr. Wind Up Bird. So that's what the title means. But anyways, the book is wacky, but in a really good way, like really well written literary wackiness. Really enjoyable. Like I said, I've read Norwegian Wood, Kafka on the Shore, and now this. I think this is my favorite one so far. Anyway, so that is Murakami's The Wind Up Bird Chronicle.